You're listening to Gateway to E-Commerce, a podcast by ClearSale. In this series, global e-commerce leaders discuss challenges, best practices, new tech, and secrets to success. And now, your hosts, Rafael and Denise.
My name is Denise Pertzer, and I'm joined by my co-host, Rafael Lorenko. Welcome, Rafael.
Hi, Denise. Hi, audience. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's good to be here today because we're going to be talking about consumer electronics. And they're in high demand, but it comes at a high cost when it comes to fraud for merchants. By the end of today's episode, you're going to have the perspective on the current landscape and be able to pinpoint what your company can do to be protected against the increased fraud and risk associated with consumer electronics. So, Rafael, electronics fraud has become more and more problematic as countries begin to embrace e-commerce. Based on what you discussed with e-commerce leaders and your experiences, why is this such a problem?
Well, Denise, I think there are many reasons why consumer electronics tend to be one of the focus of fraudsters, and in consequence of all the hard times everybody have when trying to prevent from those fraudsters to be successful. So the first one that I like to mention is the fact that it's very easy to resell those types of products, right? So you have them like they are small, they are easy to put on storage. So I think that's something that would be likely interesting for fraudsters, right?
Totally. And it's a brand, if they know if it's a brand name product, they can resell it. And so that makes it more appealing as well because they're not having to worry about that piece of it.
Yeah, and the fraudsters are looking for things that, one, are easy to resell, as I said, but two, also not too many SKUs, meaning not too many sizes and colors. So when it comes to apparel, for instance, as a comparison, that's very much different from consumer electronics because, like, just to pick up an example, an iPhone 10 Black is just an iPhone 10 Black, so it's easy to resell on marketplaces and stuff like that for a much lower price, which brings us to a second element that is high value, right?
Yes. So you've got your iPhone 10 and it's $1,000. It's much easier to recoup that $1,000 versus having to sell 10 pairs of jeans or whatever the case might be.
Yeah, exactly. Like if fraudsters just are able to offer it on the black market for 10% discount, it's already $900, just to pick up your example, right? So I feel like they are at consumer electronics, laptops, phones, GPSs are definitely a focus for fraudsters, and it's interesting because it's also a focus for first-time buyers. So people that never bought online, the high value for those products make them more attractive to be bought online, because the same way that fraudsters can make money with it, the first time buyers, when they see a 5% discount or something like that, they can see the value, and they eventually will take the risk to make their first time purchase, online purchase, buying one of those products.
That's so true. My parents never wear or buy anything online, and they bought their iPad online because there was a good deal and they didn't have to go into the store and be confused about what they were purchasing. They had their list of what they were supposed to buy and just went ahead and checked out online. So I can see definitely that would be a way to attract first-time buyers. But that makes it confusing too for the merchant, because then how do you know it's a valid sale?
Yeah, exactly. It makes very confusing because we have let's say the worst combination here, right? The high attractive for fraudsters, but also high attractive for first-time buyers. And how do you tell them apart from the other? And I think that links us to the second biggest, or as big of a problem as the chargebacks, that is the false declines. I mean, you have a very, very risky product. You have a lot of first-time buyers trying to buy it, and if you get too conservative with your fraud filters or your fraud strategy, you're going to end up affecting customer experience.
That's so true. That's one of my favorite things to bring up when we're talking to merchants here at ClearSale, because that's a piece that's easily ignored, because it's something that they don't know is an issue if they're declining somebody falsely. And that means that a good buyer goes into the cart and they're making a purchase, but for whatever reason, the filters, like you said, will catch it and decline it, in which case that customer is not going to come back. Most oftentimes that customer gets declined and they're embarrassed and they're going to go to your competitor. And everybody knows that it's easy to shop for prices and things like that. So in this case, they're not going to have that sale then, but they're also not going to become a customer of theirs in the future, and that becomes a bigger issue.
Yeah, I think you brought an interesting point because when people think about the false positive problem, I think very often people think about that particular purchase you're losing, but actually you may be losing the whole lifetime value of this customer, right? And especially with computer electronics, as you said, the loyalty is not there necessarily. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the same thing that makes fraudsters like these products, the fact that it's easy to resell, easy to buy, and make your parents comfortable buying it online, is the same reason why people will jump from one merchant to the other randomly. I mean, the first one that pops up is the first one I'm buying. It's not that I'm super attached to the brand or something, because I'm buying, again, the example of iPhone 10, it's going to be the very same product, and loyalty is not going to be there. So the false positive link brings us the potential loss of this revenue, but the revenue referring to this purchase, but also future purchase from the same consumer, right?
Absolutely. And I was reading an article we share with merchants quite often from LexisNexis that states that it's about 3 times as much of an impact financially because you don't get that follow on revenue. So when merchants are thinking about that, or not thinking about it in this case, they need to, because of the fact that it is much more impactful on their business.
Yeah, and when I think about it, and I think about the potential losses of revenues and the potential losses on chargebacks, I know that it's especially impactful for consumer electronic merchants because the margins are so tight. So we
Mm-hmm.
are talking about a business that, the markup. You look at apparel or furniture in one end of the gradient, with a high markup for their products, while consumer electronics is super high, super low margins business. So I feel like we are kind of in the nightmare of the fraud prevention, right? So high attack, high first time buyers, and low margins, low space to financial space to work your fraud prevention strategy.
Well, one of the things that I think is really interesting is, we think about fraud as being somebody just sitting back in some back room in some different country with a bunch of credit card numbers just trying to run them through. But I think there are other situations that are even more sophisticated with fraud, specific to electronics. And I know you've got some good stories to tell. What's your favorite?
Well, I have definitely a favorite one, and it's interesting. This episode is about consumer electronics because this story is specifically um, about a fraud scheme that involved televisions, right? So we had this merchant, and they were selling basically everything. I mean, furniture, electronics, and other stuff. But we started to see specifically a spike in chargebacks of in a certain region, or for transactions delivered in a certain region, specifically in a couple of zip codes. Then we tried to investigate further, and those transactions were being automatically approved by our systems, meaning things were seeming to be matching the data, right? So the credit card was used before by the same consumer, in the same address, and this is usually evidence of good orders, right?
Exactly.
So yeah, we try to make it a second layer investigation, and here's what we found. Um, Making a long story short, we found out that the fraudsters were doing an account takeover, meaning they were invading, hacking good customers' profiles at the website, at this particular website, this particular merchant's website, and they were purchasing and sending shipping those televisions to the same address of good customers. So let's say you, Denise, you have your credit card registered in a given merchant's uh, website, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then your credit card is there, your address is there, and then the they made a purchase to be delivered at your house. So out of nowhere, you see a television being shipped to your house. And then what was interesting is that a couple of days later, or in the next day, the fraudsters themselves went to went to the consumer's house or apartment, dressed like they were part of the merchant's uniform, like they were dressing the merchant's uniform with the logo and everything else. And they were asking the consumer, like, did you receive by mistake a television? And you would say, obviously, yes, because, I mean, you did not buy it. And you
Mm-hmm.
would give them back the TV, right? So who wouldn't? And then that's how they were stealing. So it's a fraud, it's credit card fraud, but how would you tell apart an easiest purchase from the fraudster's purchase utilizing the easiest data points, all the personal information?
Interesting. So it goes way beyond just the credit card. Fraudsters can get really tricky.
Exactly. Yeah, they can even dress up for the crime.
Actors in the part, for sure. Well, that's a cool story. I love hearing that. I also think that it's, from the merchant's perspective, it's just so mind-boggling, all the different things you have to think about. And one of the other things is electronics also are definitely seasonal as far as like different holidays and things like that. I know that Father's Day, for instance, is a big time, but then even other countries like Buen Fin and things like that, where there are sales going on and people are grabbing up electronics because they're expecting those sales to happen. I think that makes it even more difficult for the merchants because they don't know if that's a seasonality spike or if it's a fraud spike or that sort of thing. What do we usually tell people in that situation? Like, how do you handle that? How do you know as a merchant?
Yeah, well, that's really tricky because, as you said, not only it's hard to tell apart those sales peaks from actually fraud peaks, right? But also, you as a merchant, or if you have an internal team handling fraud prevention, you're prepared, let's say, for 100 orders a day, and out of nowhere you start getting 500, 700, or 800 orders, and on top of all the difficulties you would face with any order in particular. Now you have a spike, you have other layers of um, hard time you're facing. And if we are talking about global merchants or manufacturers or any, and at ClearSale we work with a few of them that have presence in multiple countries. Now you got to understand that these movements, these spikes, are local, right? So the Father's Day is in different dates throughout around the world. The same for Mother's Day or any other relevant date for the that triggers people to buy electronics. So this is really tricky, as you said.
It would be. And then I started thinking about too, just recently, I know we moved a bunch of people to, working at home, as did a lot of companies. And I talked to friends who moved from home to a home situation in this current environment. And a lot of them didn't have laptops to work with or things like that. So then you start to see a big spike in the purchase of laptops coming from all different sources. And again, new customers. A lot of times these employees were just given a stipend to go ahead and make the purchases that they needed to. And so that got me thinking that was probably a crazy time for a lot of merchants too, trying to disseminate whether that was fraud or not.
Yeah, definitely. And we are talking here about eventually new addresses being utilized, right? So people, I don't know if you know a lot, but I know a lot of people that are spending the quarantine in a different locations rather than the original house because it's an apartment or anything like this.
Mm-hmm.
And the number of purchases in a small period of time, especially in the beginning of all this, it's also a red flag for any fraud prevention strategy, which brings us back to the example, or to the point that you brought, Denise, about the false declines, right? So the more merchants are fearing to have fraud and chargebacks, the more they will tend to also make a mistake on the other end of the flow, right? Trying to block frauds from happening, and they may end up blocking also good consumers. So I know that you are talking to a lot of partners and merchants out there and seeing some interesting stories with or without ClearSale in terms of changing those KPIs.
That's so true. Just on the partnership side, we work with a lot of payments companies, and it's very easy to say, okay, we're going to offer a payments option, and then it becomes a commoditized situation for those partners. Whereas if they can say that they've got fraud prevention built into it, the merchant doesn't have to worry about dealing with all those sorts of things themselves, and it becomes a much stronger proposition for that partner to sell. So we always say that we're better together, and it's really true because we touch so many different parts of the purchase process, even into customer service and things like that for merchants, because we take care of the different things that they don't always know how to handle. So
Yeah, I feel like if I was a merchant, if I was working for a merchant, I would try to hire the specialist in each step of the process. Obviously, depending on on your side, on your size, sorry, you would prefer you wouldn't have the chance of hiring 10 different solution providers for 10 different problems. You may want to pick up one for two or three of the issues, but as you grow and as you have aggressive and ambitious plans, you should, as a merchant, if I were you, try to find a specialist for each step as you were describing. And what about merchants? How has been your experience in talking to them about this, especially on the consumer electronics side?
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes up quite often is the fact that people see that ClearSale works with a lot of large brands and things like that, but a huge portion of what we do is also with that smaller merchant or that medium-sized merchant, and those merchants oftentimes don't understand that fraud can sneak up and catch them as well. And the SMB client is just as susceptible because right now we've got, like we were talking about before, it's the perfect storm, right? Where we've got um, more credit cards that are being taken from phishing sites. The early stats that I saw even a month ago, it was up 65%. And then you've got more fraudsters throwing their hats in the ring because there are people that are out of jobs, they have time, and they're desperate for money. So you put all of those things together, and of course, they're not just going to hit the largest sites and just electronics. They'll dig deeper and deeper and deeper. And then we always talk to merchants, it's not about if you will get hit, it's about when. When they start to think about that and they think that they're susceptible, then it gets their minds flowing, and then a lot more questions come about. But that's probably one of the biggest things that we talk about with merchants.
Yeah, and when it comes to small and medium merchants, I feel bad for them because it's not only that they are successful as well, but actually they will get hit hard
Mm.
because imagine, I mean, I was talking about the low margins, so you gotta do like 20 good purchases, good sales to compensate one chargeback or even more because of the fact that the margins are so tight, the chargebacks will hit you so badly and will be much more impactful versus a situation where, let's say, if you are a big merchant, if you're a great corporation, yes, you have a couple of months with a worse KPI. That's bad, but you can handle. While if you are a small and medium business, eventually 2 months of a few chargebacks may even drive you to bankruptcy. That we've seen this a few times in the market.
That's so true. And we were talking to a merchant who was selling baby goods. So they thought, who's going to try to hit us for baby goods, right? And this was last spring at a conference. And we talked to them and they said, we've got our fraud stuff under control. We are only getting small chargebacks coming through, $25 to $75. And we sell $1,000 to $2,000 cribs and things like that. So it's not an issue with us. And they called us. It was not 3 months later, called us in a panic and said, we've had $15,000 in chargebacks in the last couple of weeks, and we don't know when the bleeding is going to stop. How quickly can we turn on fraud prevention? So
Yeah.
that's a very typical pattern, I think, that we see. We've heard that story. You just insert different names, different product, different numbers, but we hear that constantly, don't we?
Yeah, we do a lot. We do a lot, and again, not every company can handle like a 15,000 debt out of nowhere, right? Not
Exactly. That could take
predictable,
a
not
company
expected.
down. Yeah.
hmm Yeah, but I always want to bring every time that we talk about chargebacks and the how bad they can hit you, I always like to bring up the counterpart, that is the false declines once again, right? So when it comes to merchants, that because they are afraid of chargebacks, they end up being too aggressive on their, or too conservative, as to say, on their fraud filters and start to block too many orders. That's also not good, right? So I know that you talked to a few brands that also made that mistake, not only the chargeback, allowing chargebacks from happening, but also being too conservative, right?
Absolutely, and it's a really beautiful thing when we can take those false declines or those declined orders and turn them around into sales. Because if you think about it, the merchant has already done the work. We were working with a laptop manufacturer that works globally, and in different parts of the world, this is something that not a lot of merchants understand either if they're just selling in the U.S. as an example. But the decline rates and the fraud rates and things like that in countries like Latin America, as an example. So they want to start selling south of the border in Mexico. It's a whole different landscape. And we were working with a specific laptop manufacturer who's selling global, and they were having some of those issues and false declines. And when you can start approving those orders, and then they don't have to worry about the chargeback because it's guaranteed with a partner such as ourselves, then it makes their selling much easier. It just, it increases their net bottom dollar, and things are much better for them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one important thing, you mentioned the baby products case where they didn't know what they didn't know, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's the same for false positives. And even more frequently, we see people that just don't know, either they don't know how many orders they are declining, or they don't know that those declined orders would be a potential revenue, right? So we are talking about, like, this computer manufacturer company you just mentioned. They were declining something between 20 and 25% of their orders, but they did not call it potential revenue. They were labeling it as fraud, right? So these were frauds we were blocking from happening. But then in the next day, they started working with ClearSale. They were from something between 20 and 25. The first month of operations with us, they were already declining only 5%. So something between 15 and 20% more in sales, which everybody can benefit from, right? And if they were frauds, all of those would be turning back as chargebacks, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
which they did not. So only after implementing a new fraud prevention strategy and realizing that they were approving 15 to 20% more, and none of those orders were turning out to be chargebacks, then they believed that they shouldn't be declining all of those, because they were declining based on reasonable filters, right? So proxy IP, shipping address different from billing address, those are filters, fraud filters, that are reasonable, they are interesting. The big
Mm-hmm.
question mark is, what do you do with the orders that you flag, right?
Yeah, so a lot of merchants ask us, if you don't just use a simple rules based system like we're doing, how is it that you can get those increased orders? And that's something that's we always share in the fact that you can't just do something by machine learning alone, because you could be teaching your machine the wrong thing. With false declines, it's so true. If it starts learning that the false declines are acceptable, problem will only get worse over time instead of better. And that's why we've taken the approach of adding that human intervention and looking at anything that's suspect with a human eye, and then feeding that back into the machine. And that's where we feel is the perfect mix of things instead of just relying on a machine. And it's something that seems so simple, but it truly is what works. And the merchants are just floored by it sometimes, because I think the chargebacks hit them smack dab in the face. They see that on their statements. They see that it's a negative value. The false declines just kind of disappear into thin
A
air unless
ghost,
you're looking
yeah.
for them. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So
well,
true.
yeah, and I definitely agree with you when it comes to this human touch you just mentioned. A lot of times when we talk about manner review on fraud prevention as part of fraud prevention strategy, people think about an old-fashioned procedure, and actually, I think it's the other way. right? So we're talking about fraud rules as a first layer of protection, where you can turn on and off, enable and disable some of those rules. I think machine learning is the next layer, is the new generation, in a way of combining all those fraud rules with different wages, so you can be even more creative creating these rules, and they will turn out to be variables of your machine learning, right? And I think a third layer of protection would be having at least a small percentage of your orders being reviewed by a human being, as you said, because these many revisions will feed back to the machine learning, to the algorithms, and now the algorithm will gonna be much better than it would if you just try to decline those orders, and you would never know what would happen with those orders. So how many times we as consumers were trying to buy some in a given merchant, and for any reason, related or not to fraud, related or not to payments, we were blocked from buying, and that is so frustrating, right? So you go back to the customer experience thing, where obviously, especially if you're a first-time buyer, that are so common. They are so common on consumer electronics, or if we are talking about people buying gifts, so you are buying gifts on the last minute and you get blocked. So none of us want to be blocked. None of us want to be stopped from buying what we want, and we won't, actually, because we are going to move forward to the next merchant, as we said before, and that's really a big thing for the initial merchant we were trying to buy with, as they probably spent a lot of money in marketing to bring this person to the website, make them with a good journey, purchase journey, and then when they click and buy, they are just blocked by any of those fraud rules. So that's why I like so much this approach, where you give the benefit of the doubt to each and every order.
Exactly. Exactly. Those mid-tier, small and mid-tier merchants are scrambling and competing on so many levels with the Amazons and the other marketplaces in the world that can deliver faster, cheaper, everything else. And this is one more layer that they don't need to add to that competitive value against themselves. It's something that can be easily taken care of, and puts them more on a level playing field.
Yeah, sometimes it's not even fair, this competition you just mentioned, right? So we don't want to make it. I mean, if there's one thing that the small and medium merchants can do better, is make the customer experience so unique and personal. And I think the fraud prevention can and should play a role on this differential.
Exactly. Well, I think we could go on and on forever because we both are very passionate about fraud. But the good news is we've got other podcasts coming up. So as we wrap up today, remember that fraud is not something that you have to fight alone. That it can change constantly, and it's something that can be very seasonal as well. So all of these things, in considering that, not just the fraud of the chargebacks, but also the false decline piece. I think these are all important points that we covered today.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when it comes to finding your fraud prevention partner, I also want to add the fact that each industry has its own peculiarities, right? So we spent a few minutes today talking about how much consumer electronics is a target for fraudsters, as well as is very attractive to first-time buyers. How much the sales peaks vary from one country to the other, and how it affects the fraud prevention strategy. So a lot of things that are very specific about this specific industry. So one thing that I'd like to let as an advice to anyone listening is that fraud prevention is not like a one size fits all, right? It's something you should be looking at someone who really knows about your specific industry and has business cases with your specific industry, your specific size of company, because different sizes also bring different challenges. So I think we did cover a lot of ground here, but there would be a lot more to cover, right? But I'm glad that we have the chance to share a little bit of our knowledge and experience with our audience.
That's so true. And given that, since we talked about vertical specific things today, you can join us next time for the third podcast. And Sarah and David from our team are going to going to continue to discuss e-commerce fraud with a focus on Mexico. So we're going to start talking about more of a locale and the impacts of selling in different countries. So if you'd like to know more about how to prevent e-commerce fraud, visit our website. We have a ton of resources dedicated to this topic that can help you on your e-commerce journey at www.clear.sale. If you have any questions or would like to suggest a topic that you'd like us to cover in the future, send us an email at podcast@clear.sale. Thank you for listening.
For more e-commerce insights, visit us on our website at clear.sale.